Picture this. It is the summer of 1945. The guns have gone quiet in Europe. The Pacific is days away from total silence. And somewhere on a military depot outside of San Francisco, a soldier in a dusty olive-drab uniform is standing in front of something that stretches as far as the eye can see. Wooden crates, steel drums, canvas bags, and cardboard boxes, stacked 30 feet high in rows that disappear over the horizon. Every single one of them packed with ammunition, rifle rounds, pistol cartridges, machine gun belts, mortar shells, artillery charges, hundreds of millions of individual pieces of lethal hardware produced at a pace the world had never seen before and would likely never see again. The factories that made them had been running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for nearly 4 years straight. And now, in the span of a few weeks, the reason for all of it, the war itself, was simply gone. There was no plan for this. No one had truly thought it through. The United States government, the most powerful military apparatus in human history at that moment, was staring down a stockpile of ammunition so enormous it defied easy comprehension, and it had almost no idea what to do with it. Some of it would be destroyed, some of it would be shipped overseas, some of it would quietly find its way into the hands of ordinary American civilians, sold out of barrels at hardware stores and gas stations for a penny or two per round. But the real story, the story almost no one knows, is what happened after that. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to all that surplus World War II ammunition after the guns fell silent? To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of what the United States had produced. When America entered the war in December of 1941, it was not yet the industrial giant it would become. But within 18 months, the transformation was staggering. By 1943, American factories were producing over 45 billion rounds of small arms ammunition per year. Read that number again, 45 billion rounds. In a single year. Plants in St. Louis, Denver, Minneapolis, and a dozen other cities ran without pause. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri alone was producing millions of rounds every single day. By the time Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the United States had accumulated ammunition stockpiles that had been calculated in tonnage rather than individual rounds, because individual rounds was simply too small a unit to make the numbers feel real. Military planners had anticipated a land invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that, by the most conservative estimates, would have required another full year of the most brutal fighting imaginable. Ammunition had been stockpiled accordingly. When that invasion never came, all of that preparation, all of those billions of rounds had nowhere to go. The government found itself holding the largest single accumulation of lethal material any nation had ever tried to demobilize, and the clock was already ticking because storing ammunition costs money, costs space, and carries with it a very real danger that never simply goes away. In the weeks immediately following the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945, the United States military faced a logistical crisis that historians have largely overlooked. Demobilization was happening at a furious pace. 12 million men and women needed to come home. Bases needed to be closed, equipment needed to be accounted for, redistributed or discarded, and ammunition, mountains of it, needed to be dealt with before it became a liability. Imagine walking through one of those depots in the fall of 1945. The air smells of Cosmoline, the rust-preventive grease packed into every crate of military hardware, and beneath that, the faint, sharp chemical tang of propellant and primer compound. Steel drums are stacked 4 and 5 high. Wooden crates stamped with military lot numbers and caliber designations stretch down every aisle. The sheer weight of the inventory is pressing into the concrete floors, and it all needs to move. The initial response was disorganized because it almost had to be. Different branches of the military handled their surpluses differently. The Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps all had separate supply chains. separate storage depots, and separate ideas about what should be saved and what should go. In the Pacific Theater especially, huge quantities of ammunition were in remote locations, on islands, aboard ships, in jungle depots, where transportation costs alone made any kind of orderly recovery nearly impossible. Some of it was simply dumped into the ocean on the spot, a decision that was considered entirely routine at the time, and whose consequences are still being discovered today. On the European side, the picture was equally complicated. American forces had pushed vast quantities of ammunition forward as they advanced across France, Belgium, and into Germany. When the fighting stopped, those forward depots were often in areas now controlled by Allied occupation forces, surrounded by a civilian population that was desperate, hungry, and not inclined to ask questions about where useful materials came from. Looting of military depots was rampant in the immediate post-war months, not just by desperate German civilians but by soldiers from every army present. American GEs, heading home after years of service, sometimes quietly slipped handguns, pistols or boxes of ammunition into their duffel bags as unofficial souvenirs. The military knew this was happening. It was largely tolerated, at least initially, because the alternative, strictly accounting for every round in a chaotic post-war environment, was simply not practical. The first and most immediate answer to the surplus ammunition problem was destruction, and it happened on a scale that is difficult to visualize even with the historical record in front of you. The military's preferred method was open detonation, taking ammunition out to remote areas, piling it in large quantities and setting it off. In the Pacific, this often meant literally pushing crates off the backs of trucks into the ocean or detonating them on remote beaches. Film footage from 1945 and 1946 shows columns of black smoke rising from military depots across the continental United States as well. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, and large-caliber ammunition that couldn't easily be repurposed were detonated in controlled fields at places like the Letterkenny Army Depot in Pennsylvania and the Toole Army Depot in Utah. The explosions were so routine that local residents stopped paying them much attention. It was just the sound of the government cleaning up. But not all of the destruction was so straightforward. Chemical ammunition, rounds loaded with mustard gas, lewisite, and other agents, presented a far more serious disposal challenge. The United States had produced enormous quantities of chemical weapons during the war, partly as a deterrent and partly in preparation for a Pacific campaign that military planners feared might require their use. After the war, tens of thousands of tons of chemical munitions were disposed of through a method that was considered entirely acceptable at the time, but would be viewed with horror today. They were loaded onto ships, taken out to deep water and dumped into the ocean. Operation Chase, an acronym for Cut Holes and Sink 'em, was not a single event, but a series of ocean disposal operations that continued from the late 1940s all the way through 1970. Hundreds of thousands of chemical shells, bombs, and containers were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Gulf of Mexico, and even some inland waterways. Today, fishermen occasionally pull up corroded shells in their nets off the coasts of New Jersey, Alabama, and Hawaii. The material is still there, slowly corroding on the seafloor, and no one has a complete inventory of exactly where all of it went. Here is where the story takes its most unexpected and, for most people, genuinely astonishing turn. In the late 1940s and through most of the 1950s, the United States government made a deliberate decision to sell large quantities of surplus small arms ammunition directly to the American civilian market. This was not a black market or an underground operation. It was official policy, administered through the Director of Civilian Marksmanship, a government program that had existed since 1903 and whose original purpose was to ensure that American civilians remained proficient with firearms in case the nation ever needed to rapidly expand its military. The program purchased surplus military ammunition from the government at cost and resold it to qualified civilian shooters, gun clubs, and rifle associations at prices that were, by any measure, extraordinarily low. calibers like .30-06 Springfield, .30 Carbine, and .45 ACP, all of which had been produced in truly astronomical quantities for the war, flooded the civilian market at prices that amounted to a penny or two per round when bought in bulk. But the director of civilian marksmanship was only one channel. The broader civilian surplus market was fed by a network of Army-Navy surplus stores, hardware stores, and yes, as countless Americans of a certain age clearly remember, gas stations and general stores, particularly in rural areas, where barrels of loose military surplus ammunition sat openly on the floor or near the counter, available to anyone who walked in and wanted to scoop out a handful. This was not unusual. It was not controversial. It was simply commerce. The cultural context is important here. In post-war America, firearm ownership was nearly universal in rural communities. Hunting was a primary source of food for millions of families, and the idea that there might be any particular concern about selling ammunition to ordinary citizens would have struck most Americans as frankly peculiar. The surplus ammunition was, in many cases, far better quality than anything a civilian shooter could otherwise afford. Military specification ammunition was made to exacting standards, using the highest quality brass, powder, and primers available, because soldiers' lives depended on it not failing. For a farmer in Kansas or a deer hunter in Maine, buying a coffee can full of .30-06 cartridges for $1 was simply a good deal. This era, roughly from 1946 through the mid-1960s, is the period that most older American shooters and collectors remember with something close to nostalgia. The ammunition was everywhere. It was cheap. It worked. And almost nobody thought to ask where it had come from, or where it was going. Not all surplus American ammunition stayed in America. A very large portion of it, historians estimate tens of billions of rounds, was transferred to foreign governments, allied nations, and newly formed military forces around the world as part of a deliberate Cold War strategy. The logic was straightforward. The United States needed friendly nations to be armed and capable of resisting Soviet expansion. American surplus weapons and ammunition were available in enormous quantities. The two facts connected naturally into a policy of military aid that shaped the geopolitics of the entire post-war world. Under programs like the Mutual Defense Assistance Act of 1949 and later the Military Assistance Program, American surplus ammunition flowed to Western Europe, South Korea, Taiwan, Greece, Turkey, Iran, and dozens of other nations. Countries that had just finished the war with almost nothing in their arsenals were suddenly equipped with American rifles, machine guns, and millions of rounds to feed them. In some cases, this ammunition would be used in wars that broke out within just a few years of being transferred. American surplus .30-06 ammunition, manufactured in 1943 and 1944, was being fired in the Korean War by 1950. The same cartridges that had been loaded into M1 Garands in the hedgerows of Normandy were now being chambered in the mountains of the Korean Peninsula. The trail of American surplus ammunition through the Cold War is extraordinarily long and, in some cases, deeply troubling. Ammunition transferred to governments that later fell, were overthrown, or change sides ended up in places and in hands that the original transfers had never intended. Some portion of American surplus World War II ammunition has been documented in conflicts as late as the 1980s and 1990s, found in Afghanistan, in African civil wars, in Central American conflicts. The head stamp on a cartridge case, and the tiny stamped markings on the base that identify the manufacturer and year of production, tells a story that the round itself cannot. A cartridge head-stamped LC-44 was made at the Lake City plant in Missouri in 1944. Finding that head stamp in a conflict 50 years later and 10,000 miles away is a small, specific, and quietly haunting reminder of how far and how long the material consequences of the Second World War truly reached. The era of surplus ammunition sold openly at gas stations and hardware stores came to an end not with a sudden dramatic event, but with a piece of legislation that changed the regulatory landscape of American firearms commerce permanently. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed in the wake of the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., and among its many provisions was a new framework for the sale and distribution of ammunition that made the old informal surplus market effectively impossible to continue. Dealers were now required to keep records. Certain categories of buyers were prohibited. The casual, barrel-in-the-corner model of ammunition retail was replaced by a more regulated system that, while far from restrictive by modern global standards, was enough to end the particular era of post-war surplus availability. The timing was not coincidental. By 1968, much of the most accessible World War II surplus had already been sold off, shot up, or redistributed. 20 years of civilian sales, foreign military aid, and ongoing destruction programs had put a significant dent in the original stockpiles. What remained was increasingly stored in long-term military depots, often in conditions that were less than ideal, and was being quietly evaluated for disposal or conversion on an ongoing basis. The passing of the Gun Control Act of 1968 thus marks a clean historical boundary. Before it, you could walk into a feed store in rural Georgia and buy a paper bag full of .30-06 cartridges for the price of a cup of coffee. After it, that world was gone. There are corners of this history that the mainstream record barely touches, and they are worth pausing on because they reveal just how strange and unpredictable the afterlife of wartime ammunition truly was. Consider the story of the buried ammunition depots in the Pacific. When American forces captured islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Peleliu, they often found Japanese ammunition dumps that had been hastily concealed or abandoned. After the war, the disposition of this captured enemy ammunition was handled inconsistently. Some was destroyed. Some was catalogued and shipped back for analysis. But a significant portion was simply left in place, buried under tropical vegetation or sealed in natural caves, because moving it was expensive and the islands were remote. Decades later, construction workers breaking ground for hotels and roads on these same islands would strike buried caches of World War II ammunition, Japanese and American alike, perfectly preserved by the dry conditions inside the caves. On Saipan alone, unexploded ordnance disposal teams are still called out on a regular basis as development continues on the island. The problem is not academic. In 2018, a construction crew on Tinian unearthed a cache of American .50 caliber ammunition still in its original sealed metal containers in near-perfect condition after more than 70 years underground. Then there is the story of the Olympic arms lot. In the early 1980s, a firearms distributor in the Pacific Northwest purchased a large quantity of surplus military .30 carbine ammunition that had been sitting in a government warehouse for decades. When shooters began using it, they discovered something remarkable. The ammunition performed as well as the day it had been made. The brass was clean, the primers fired every time, the powder charges were consistent. Military specification storage had preserved it almost perfectly. It became something of a legend among collectors and enthusiasts, a demonstration that well-made, properly stored ammunition does not simply degrade with time the way most people assume. Perhaps the most quietly extraordinary story, however, involves the deep-sea dumping operations and what divers have found in the decades since. Off the coast of New Jersey, in water between 100 and 300 feet deep, recreational and commercial divers have documented fields of corroded military ordnance covering hundreds of acres of seafloor. Most of it is inert, the propellants long since dissolved, the primers dead. But the chemical rounds are different. Divers and fishermen who have come into contact with leaking chemical shells off the New Jersey and Alabama coastlines have reported skin burns, respiratory irritation, and in some cases more serious injuries. The material dumped in those post-war years has not disappeared. It has simply moved into a different phase of its existence, corroding slowly in the cold and the dark, waiting to be found. One of the most persistent and underappreciated facts about World War II surplus ammunition is simply that a great deal of it is still in circulation today. Not in military depots or government warehouses, but in private hands, in the back of gun safes, in old ammunition cans stored in barns and basements, in collections that have passed from grandfather to son, without anyone thinking particularly hard about what they were holding. Surplus .30-06 ammunition with 1940s head stamps still shows up at gun shows and estate sales. Old military .45 ACP rounds still cycle through 1911 pattern pistols at shooting ranges across the country. The ammunition that was made to fight a world war is, in many cases, still shooting. This is a testament to the quality of the manufacturing. The same exacting standards that were meant to ensure reliability under the worst combat conditions have also ensured a remarkably long functional lifespan under ordinary storage conditions. It is also a reflection of how much was made. When you produce 45 billion rounds in a single year for 4 years across dozens of factories, you produce more than any war, even the Second World War, can ever consume. The excess finds its way into every corner of civilian life and stays there for generations, long after the context that produced it has faded from living memory. The ocean disposal operations of the post-war years deserve more attention than they typically receive, because their consequences are ongoing and in some places genuinely dangerous. Between 1946 and 1970, the United States dumped an estimated 64 million pounds of nerve and mustard agents into the ocean, along with nearly 400,000 chemical-filled bombs, shells, and containers. These figures come from a 1998 report by the United States Army that represented the first systematic attempt to document what had actually been disposed of and where. The report's conclusion, that the full scope of the dumping was not completely known even to the government, was not reassuring. In waters off Hawaii, divers have documented drums of chemical agents sitting on the seafloor in relatively shallow water, accessible to recreational divers who have no idea what they are looking at. In the Baltic Sea, where British and Soviet forces conducted their own ocean disposal operations, the situation is even more serious. Corroding chemical shells have been accidentally trawled up by fishing boats on a regular basis for decades, and the seafloor contamination is now recognized as a serious long-term environmental and public health concern. The conventional ammunition dumped in these same operations is less immediately dangerous, but contributes its own complications. Large steel artillery shells and bombs sitting on the seafloor create navigational hazards, interfere with the laying of submarine cables and pipelines, and occasionally wash ashore during storms. On the beaches of Hawaii and along portions of the Gulf Coast, beachcombers have found corroded military ordnance that washed in from offshore disposal sites after heavy weather. Every one of those discoveries requires a response from explosive ordnance disposal teams, a mobilization of resources, and a reminder that the material consequences of the war did not end when the fighting did. Today, World War II surplus ammunition occupies a peculiar place in the American cultural landscape. Some of it lives in museum collections, properly preserved and displayed, where it represents the industrial history of the war effort, a physical embodiment of the scale of mobilization that defeated the Axis powers. The National Firearms Museum in Virginia, the Rock Island Arsenal Museum in Illinois, and dozens of smaller collections around the country hold examples of every type of ammunition produced during the war. From the humble .30 carbine to the massive 16-inch naval shells that the Iowa-class battleships fired in the Pacific. Some of it lives in private collections, often in old military surplus ammunition cans, the distinctive olive-drab metal containers with the wire bale handles, that have become collectible objects in their own right, sought after by military history enthusiasts who want not just the ammunition, but the original packaging, the original stenciling, the original smell of cosmoline that somehow still lingers decades later, and some of it is still being found for the very first time. Construction projects in former military installations, archaeological surveys of old depot sites, and the ongoing work of unexploded ordnance disposal teams continue to turn up World War II-era ammunition in locations that range from the ordinary to the genuinely surprising. In 2015, workers excavating a site for a new housing development in a suburb of Sacramento, a suburb built in the 1950s on land that had previously been part of a military storage facility, uncovered a cache of .30-06 ammunition in sealed crates, the markings on the wood still legible after 60 years underground. The Lake City head stamps on the cartridges dated them to 1944. They were taken away by an ordnance disposal team, but not before one of the workers took a photograph that circulated briefly on social media, attracting the attention of history enthusiasts who recognized immediately what they were looking at. There is something that stays with you when you follow this story all the way through. From the factory floors running through the night in 1943 to the gas station barrels of the 1950s to the corroding drums on the seafloor today. It is the sheer persistence of material things. A war is a human event. It is made of decisions and passions and fears and sacrifices. And when it ends, those things fade. The soldiers age and die. The generals are forgotten. The grievances that started the fighting become the subject of academic debate. But the physical material, the steel, the brass, the powder, the primer compound, does not fade at the same pace. It corrodes slowly. It migrates through the environment. It passes from hand to hand across generations, often with no one quite sure where it came from or what it was originally made for. The surplus ammunition of the Second World War was produced in service of a specific and terrible purpose: to kill, as efficiently as possible, the enemies of the United States and its allies. That purpose was fulfilled, more or less, and then the war ended. But the ammunition kept going. It went into gas station barrels and gun safes and foreign arsenals and ocean trenches and museum display cases and barn lofts. It kept existing, in the stubbornly indifferent way that physical objects exist, long after the world that created it had moved on. Some of it is still out there right now, sitting in the dark somewhere, in a condition that would probably surprise you. It is, in a very real sense, the last surviving physical presence of the most destructive conflict in human history, and most of us walk past it or over it or around it every single day without ever knowing it is there. That, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing about it, not where it went, but how quietly it stayed.